I'm Alex Silvis. I'm the Endangered Species Coordinator for the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, and my role here at the agency is varied, but the short version is I'm responsible for overseeing all of our efforts for federally listed species in the state. Um, and so I want to talk to you today, instead of about very specific things on the ground, but to talk to you a little bit about science and regulatory process. I think that's something that um, it's something a lot of people don't necessarily have a strong context for unless they work in a state or federal agency. So before we get there, one of the things I love about pollinator work is that it's actually fairly accessible and people are interested. So many things that we work on for, conservation are things that people might have a negative feeling about. A big one that I deal with is bats. There are a lot of negative feelings about bats, but you don't run into that so much with pollinator gardens. People love flowers, people love butterflies. So there's that interest, but it's also, like I said, accessible. There are a lot of guidance out there for how people can do backyard pollinator conservation efforts, and that's the other thing about pollinator work is that it's nothing is easy per se, but it's accessible. You can make a small pollinator garden in a small backyard. It's nice. You can't do that for a lot of other species that require maybe large ranges or very specific habitat needs, or can't necessarily access habitat. You create great habitat for a small terrestrial salamander in your backyard, but they may not be able to get to your backyard the way that, say, a butterfly can. So, while it's fairly easy for individual landowners, for private citizens and private entities, state and federal agencies have increased responsibilities under state and federal law, particularly when it comes to federally listed species. So that's federally threatened or endangered species. And that's through the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act is large and varied and detailed, but there are three sections in particular from state and federal agency perspective that are very important. That'd be Section 6, which is actually where the ESA lines out how the Fish and Wildlife Service will cooperate with states for conservation purposes. And then Sections 7 and 10, which deal with interagency cooperation and exceptions, which really a lot of the time boils down to understanding take, which is to harm, harass, hunt, pursue, kill, etc., federally listed species. So where it comes back to take, we always have the responsibility as state and federal agencies to avoid harm or specifically take. And so we have specific consultation processes that we use, both formal and informal, with Fish and Wildlife Service, where we, describe an action that we are going to take, and we look at how it might affect species that are federally listed. And so this flow chart is actually, you don't have to read all the details of the flow chart. That's not important. It's just to show you that there is a flow chart that exists for different species. This one's specific to the rusty patch bumblebee. So we step through all of this process to, figure out, or to make sure that we're not going to cause take. That's always the first thing. So one of the other things that people, understanding how we might avoid take and how we do actions, to be successful in that, we must build capability and capacity. And while, state and federal agencies have a lot of biologists employed, federally listed species have very specific requirements under the ESA. And so general knowledge and background are hugely foundational, but we also require very specific expertise and knowledge on listed species because our responsibilities are higher for those species. So the photo on the left actually is Mark Hepner giving a training for DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and NRCS, with Natural Resource Conservation Service, staff members about Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and that was actually just last week. And Mark did a fantastic job. If you need training, Mark certainly is deeply knowledgeable. But so we have to build that capability. So we're just getting up to speed on Rusty Patch Bumblebee and building a lot of internal expertise on that species by working with experts like Mark. But we also have to make that capacity. So West Virginia right now has 30 federally threatened or endangered species. And so when a new species added to the list, we have to work on that species, but we also have to shuffle working on that species with working on other species. So for example, we have to work with the Cheat Mountain salamander and the Virginia big-eared bat and the rusty patch bumblebee. So, if you only have two listed species, you spend 50% of your time on each, say. When you have a new species, so when you add rusty patch, now we're dividing our time in thirds, although it's more like 30ths with our species. So we have to make that capacity in our schedule, which always involves trade-offs that we have to deal with. One of the things that really is critical for us, at least as a state agency, is forward planning. So Mark already showed these maps, but the map on the left is the high and low priority zones for rusty patch bumblebee. in our region, and on the right is the recovery grids with their, status. And so we think we have to forward plan at a lot of scales, but one of the big things we have to forward plan on is at spatial scale. So we think about how we're going to be working in the state, and so we're thinking about where can we find the species, what's going to be coming down the pipe. That has a big effect on how we think and how we plan. So one of the things that we've done as a state agency is to develop a multi-phase plan for how we're going to deal with rusty patch bumblebee. And so phase 1 and 2 basically are building out, working with people like Mark and other state and federal agency biologists and private citizens to assess, the current extent and connectivity of known populations, and then to also monitor those populations. Mark talked about assessing status and health of rusty patch bumblebee colonies. That we're phasing into that as we learn more. Basically, we're trying to work off of sound conservation science and useful information. Um, uh, it maybe it's not an analogy per se, but one thing I always like to point out is that we have a limited number of dollars to work on anything, and we have a limited amount of time. So by focusing where we can get the most benefit for the least input is a wise use of resources for us. And so that's, sort of what our plan is working at. And then the phase 3 of our plan is implementing those focused conservation and land management activities where known populations exist while accounting for the, the health and status of those individual populations. But one thing we have too is that as new species get listed or as our needs change, we have to be able to adapt to that as an agency, and we have to do that at large spatial scales and across a whole array of species and habitats. So, for example, we have to be able to adapt to changing needs for basic forest management. We have to, consider if we're going to need to manage for hunting, for turkey or deer, which are huge for our agency. We might also need to manage for rattlesnakes, work on conservation for that species. We also have to balance out fly fishing and stream access. We have to continue monitoring the now successfully delisted northern flying squirrel. And we also look at conservation restoration efforts, for example, red spruce restoration in the Alleghenies. So we have to be able to adapt to the needs of the time. And so we have to have future flexibility. It comes down to balancing conservation priorities, not just our priorities, but conservation priorities in general. And I would encourage you, actually, if you're interested in the Division of Natural Resources conservation priorities, to take a look at our state wildlife action plan. It lays out a lot of our priorities for non-game species. And it's a tool that's intended to help partners or to help the interested public, see what they could do or what's important to the DNR in their backyards, essentially. But we also have to balance out with different resource needs. So for, it's priorities at large scale, resource needs in specific areas. But we also have to balance out public requirements because we are a public agency. We have to be responsive to public needs and public demand. So for example, when the governor, has an initiative which is, perceived as a mandate from the electorate, we are tasked with acting on that. And so we always have to balance those things. Um, and so we really need regulatory assurances. We really benefit from them, at least. So for example, when we take conservation actions and we're doing something to benefit a listed species or any species, it's nice to know that, or it gives us a lot of comfort and allows us to more actively plan when we know what could happen in the future. And that's regulatorily speaking. So we want those regulatory assurances that what we're doing today isn't going to hinder us tomorrow when we have changing conservation priorities or different resource needs or different public requirements. And so, again, everything with listed species, sort of it comes back to do no harm. So one of the ways that we can get to the regulatory assurance while avoiding harm is with a formal tool called a safe harbor agreement. It's a voluntary but formal agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're renewable agreements that are open to any non-federal landowner that cover basically management of an area for the benefit of a federally threatened or endangered species that allows some small level of incidental take associated with proactive management for that species. Um, and one of the nice things as a state agency is that a safe harbor agreement can be statewide. So for example, if the DNR sets up a statewide safe harbor agreement, we potentially can enroll other interested partners under our safe harbor agreement. So while we develop the safe harbor agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or we would, then we have the ability to administer it in the state to enroll partners. And I realize there are some Fish and Wildlife Service people on the call, and so I'm not trying to give you all of the specific details of safe harbor agreements, just trying to give kind of the overview. So where rubber meets the road on this is they're actually developed specifically hand in hand with the Fish and Wildlife Service and specifically with the local ecological services field office. And so to develop a safe harbor agreement, the proponent in this case for Rusty Patch Bumblebee, the Division of Natural Resources, and this is something that we're working on pursuing. We have to provide background information that that describes what areas we want to enroll, what are their current conditions, how many acres, what do we plan on doing for the species, what do we think the impacts are going to be, and then what is the benefit of that action going to be to the species. And so when developed with the service, the timeline and the services estimation is roughly 3 to 12 months, and that depends on the complexity of the agreement. But the big benefit again is that management flexibility. We know that if we take certain actions to promote, say, Rusty Patch Bumblebee, that we will be able to continue doing those activities to benefit the species while knowing that we're not going to be revisited later to discuss specifics of, well, is that action causing take, because we've already planned it out in such a way that we know there's going to be a net benefit. It also allows specifically for areas that are managed for the benefit of that species to be rolled back to initial conditions. So for example, if we have a fescue field at one of our wildlife management areas and we decide that we're going to turn it into a big pollinator planting, we could manage it as a pollinator area and we could manage it for brood habitat, say, simultaneously. um, but we may be tasked very specifically with changing that over to, say, a new forest for carbon sequestration if that's a mandate that we receive um, from the governor. If that becomes a key conservation priority nationwide, we could be tasked with changing that. So that would mean that we would be reverting that pollinator planting back to original condition, which would be that fescue field, and then from there we could take it into a different management to meet a current or changing need. And where this really becomes helpful is, specifically you think, well, why would you do that? Because you're going to lose potentially good pollinator habitat. The hope is with the safe harbor agreement, by putting in and doing a lot of proactive work, the effect of changing any one small area is going to have a limited, or minuscule effect, minuscule step back on the recovery of the species. Hopefully that makes sense. One of the other tools that we have access to, that non-federal partners have access to, are candidate conservation agreements, and those are also voluntary agreements. But whereas a safe harbor agreement is for a species that's currently federally threatened or endangered, candidate conservation agreement is for a species that is not listed, or for a species that's found to be warranted but precluded from listing. And so, again, not to speak for Fish and Wildlife Service, but species that are warranted but precluded mean that they meet the criteria for being federally listed as threatened or endangered, but they're precluded from being listed because of other reasons. So for example, other listing workloads or other species with a higher priority. So only so many species, well, only so many resources to list individual species at a given time. And so I'm going to kind of gloss over some of the details with the candidate conservation agreements, but these don't give you a permit for incidental take. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. A candidate conservation agreement with assurances is actually, it's very similar to a CCA. So this is a CCAA, and that it's a voluntary agreement designed to preempt listing under the ESA. And so again, with that preempting, the species is warranted but precluded, you can step in with a CCA or CCAA, take proactive conservation measures that hopefully stave off the listing of that species by recovering it before the listing would actually happen. And so the CCAA is open to non-federal partners, and they actually issue a permit for incidental take for conservation activities. And this is similar to the Safe Harbor Agreement, where take for conservation activities is found to be small relative to the net benefit of taking those conservation activities. And it's easiest to sort of conceptualize the CCAA and a CCA specifically with respect to the Monarch. So in 2020, the Fish and Wildlife Service found that the Monarch was warranted but precluded from being federally listed. And so there was a coalition of different groups that came together and developed CCA and CCAA, which was also completed in 2020. And that covers management of rights of way, and specifically for promoting pollinator management, specifically monarch management or habitat management on existing rights of way. And so it's anticipated that CCA, CCAA could cover up to 2.3 million acres of rights of way, which will theoretically now be managed specifically um, to include benefits for the monarch butterfly. And so with that species being, warranted but precluded, if those actions are taken, the hope and the goal is that that will be enough to help avert listing of the monarch at a future date, because those actions will have benefited the species and help facilitate recovery. Um, Granted, I think many of us probably are already aware that a lot of the winter habitat is a limiting factor in this, but in the recovery of the monarch. But that's kind of the overarching with the CCAA and CCA, specifically for the monarch. Eligible applicants can enroll through the University of Illinois Chicago, and if you have responsibility for managing energy or transportation lands or rights of way, I would encourage you to, if you're not involved with the CCA or CCAA, to take a look at it. But both the Safe Harbor Agreement and the CCA, CCAAs are tools that we can use as a state agency to proactively plan for managing these species that give us some regulatory assurances that we can meet our multi-objective uh, needs and requirements. The other thing I wanted to mention about, regulatorily about working on pollinator conservation is that individual agencies don't exist in a vacuum. We have to respond to the regulatory demands, well, the regulatory requirements, I should say, of other agencies. So, for example, uh, the DNR, we're working on pollinator mixes statewide. Actually, we're working on different regional mixes that focus on what species are present in any given region, pollinator resource so plans. But we also have to consider as we're trying to promote the use of our pollinator mixes, which we think will have ecological benefits in using plants, from appropriate ecoregions across the state. But we have to consider the Department of Environmental Protection, their rights of way stability requirements. So rights of way, especially, West Virginia is obviously a mountainous state, slopes over, I think it's 20%, have very specific soil stability requirements. And so when we recommend pollinator mixes and we try and encourage their use on rights of way, we have to consider what are the DEP's requirements for stability, for soil stability and retention when we develop that mix, if we want it to be used broadly on rights of way. We also have things like public safety. So, for example, Division of Highways. We're working with Division of Highways to try and encourage pollinator management along roadsides to reduce mowing specifically. But we also have to work with them to consider what visibility is required along roadways. Are plantings or are these unmowed areas going to impair visibility along roadways? And that's a public safety issue. And we also have areas where we have overlapping jurisdiction. So with pollinators in particular, Division of Natural Resources, interestingly enough, doesn't have regulatory authority in general over terrestrial invertebrates. We have regulatory authority over aquatic invertebrates and federally listed invertebrates. So we have regulatory authority over rusty patch bumblebee, but we don't over monarch because that actually falls under the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. And so we have to work with the Department of Agriculture, um, you know, relative to our respective jurisdictions, which can change with the status of the species. I know I tossed a lot out there and I was going fairly quick. I was hoping this would be an overview. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Um, so I'm happy to take questions.